So here's how this works. Usually you're sitting off stage, maybe you're in the audience, maybe you're just around a curtain, you might even be in a green room, while somebody you probably barely know talks about what you are, what you want to say, and what they've read about you either on the internet or on the tiny card in front of them. The audience, they applaud politely. Maybe they applaud enthusiastically if you're lucky. And you round that corner and you look at a sea of faces that are expecting something good, and you walk up to the microphone and you start. So hello, this is Jason Scott. You're listening to the Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It podcast, a podcast about thoughts, ideas, history, mystery, weirdness, wonder, and about what I've learned. So who am I? Well, I'm a historian, a documentary filmmaker, an archivist, an activist, and a storyteller. And I decided to make a podcast for a very weird reason, which was debt. I found myself in a market amount of debt from years of both speculatory projects to save history, or in some cases just bad, weird decisions. And so I was trying to figure out a way to get out of it. And I thought, why not make a podcast and invite people to do a Patreon for each episode? And from there, just work my way out of it. I'm not sure where this podcast is going to go, but I know it's going to have a lot of stories. I know it's going to be something that's going to go into a lot of directions. And for people who have heard me give presentations, and I've been giving presentations on and off for about 20 years, they kind of know what they're in for. If you don't, I have a lot of weird ideas about the world, and I tend to draw unusual connections, but most of all, I still have a sense of wonder. I still have this sense that out in the world are amazing things to discover, and often people just don't know about them. And bringing them to light and calling attention to them has always been one of my greatest joys. Let's rewind a little bit. Let's talk about how I got here. I'm often asked, when did I become an archivist and learn how to be an archivist? When I was 9, my mother decided to leave my father and take the kids with her. And she did this when he wasn't home. And she said to the three of us, take what you need and we're going to go. And when you're 9, that's a pretty tough question to come across. What do you need? Take it with you, because you're not coming back. It turns out that I need a blanket and a dog. I grabbed my favorite blanket and I took my dog. A lot of lessons came out in that for me. I learned about the impermanence of things one might think are permanent. I learned that one had to think fast about what was most important to oneself. And I came away with a sense of not trusting anything to stay around if I didn't make the effort to take it with me. What this meant was that in my early teens, when I was on bulletin board systems and starting to go online a lot, I never trusted that any computer bulletin board I called would ever be there when I came back. And so I would download everything unique about that bulletin board system. And bulletin board systems would often have a section of writings or libraries, which they called G files or text files. And I would download all of the text files. So I would have floppy disks on top of floppy disks of bulletin board systems that, as time proved, actually didn't stick around very long at all. I would call a bulletin board system, download all of its text files, come back in a week, and it would be down, it would be gone. So I collected all of those text files, put them away, and went to college. So in my late 20s, I thought, hey, the web is here. It's 1998. Everything's online now. Why don't I go look up on the Alta Vista search engine what is available about bulletin board systems? I can finally learn about everything I was on back in my teens. And so I did a search for my favorite bulletin board system and nothing came up. That was weird. So then I went and looked up bulletin board systems in general, discovered that there wasn't really anything about them. And there certainly weren't these text files that I had grabbed when I was young. So I registered textfiles.com, and I put up my entire collection from the old floppies that I had, and just started describing them and making them available to people. Pretty straightforward fashion, and it turned out it really took off because these weren't just experiences of my own. These were writings and essays and thoughts that everybody had had back then, and here they were again. That kind of got me on this path of being on the World Wide Web and being an archivist of computer material and computer historical material that maybe others weren't really concentrating on. From there, it wasn't too long before I started to do bulletin board system number lists, started to create a site of every bulletin board system I ever could find in the text files. And from there, the stories that came from people inspired me to use my dormant film degree to make a documentary on bulletin board systems, which I cleverly named BBS the Documentary. That sold well. That got lots of attention. And so after that was done, I thought, well, what else have I done in my youth that I don't see around? So I worked on a documentary about text adventures that became a movie called GitLamp. In the meantime, I was being invited to various conferences or conventions and being asked to speak about computer history from what my text files had to say and what I'd researched on my own. So I kind of became known as the old guy who talked about the old stuff. Started a blog, ascii.textfiles.com, started to write about all sorts of subjects. And over time, I just kind of became a person who was the court of last resort for finding things that were disappearing online. Ultimately, in 2009, I co-founded a group called Archive Team. And Archive Team was a very activist group, very angry, who were just blisteringly pissed off about all of these sites that were going away that had been around since the early 90s that were a whole folklore. And so we started to take action to download these things aggressively to make sure that even though somebody was shutting a switch off somewhere, that they weren't gone completely. From there, I ended up joining the Internet Archive with the title of Free Range Archivist, where I've remained to this day, and where I'm always trying to put up as much information as possible and reaching out to people who have collections who don't know how to deal with them or get them online and help them do so. And it's a wonderful job and a wonderful life. Here I am, I'm 47, and decided to start to put my thoughts down in podcast form. I want to talk a little bit about debt and what brought me to where I am, and why I think it's something that's really important for people to understand, especially people who are considered to be really good in whatever field they're in. So I think the problem is that the world thinks of smart in a pretty binary fashion. That is to say, it kind of says you're either dumb or ignorant or smart and wise. And it's just this kind of weird continuum, like some weird Xbox achievement, like you read 20 books and you're this amount smarter, or you research this amount of information and you're this amount smarter, until eventually you hit some sort of upper level. And in that upper level, you are some sort of generalist genius who can slide under a car or walk into the woods or go in front of a huge crowd of people and just kill it. And the fact is that's not how the world works at all. It's actually a large continuum, an acreage, maybe even a 3D cube of knowledge, where you can become really good at some aspect of a subject, but then fail to really understand the ramifications of what you're doing, or to be unaware of the rules and laws that dictate some area of knowledge. And then you find yourself sunk. So what I'm talking about here, for example, are taxes. In the United States, the tax code is really complicated, and the rules in which you put your finances into shape are not intuitive. They're not something you can just wing together. There are forms and declarations and terms that even somebody who's a brilliant developer or a smart manager might not really be aware of. And what happens then is you find yourself at the wrong end of the stick, which is what I did. I made some really, I guess, not so much poor, but ignorant decisions, and found myself thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars in debt to the government for various, sales and checks and writings and so on, going back a few years. So I made the secret move. I got an accountant, and we worked through things with the government. And so I went from owing them a massive amount of money to a smaller amount of money. And then I started to work down that debt. Things have gone along pretty well. There have been incredibly generous people who've helped pay down that debt significantly. So I really only owe the government maybe a few $1,000s. Meanwhile, I owe my accountant some money. I also owe some bills to a few other locations. I have some medical bills from a heart attack that I had in February. And it just keeps, being something that's sitting in my life. And what I found when I was open about it, because I think a lot of people aren't open about it, is that it was a shared problem among a lot of people that very few people talked about. That is to say, I'd find out from somebody writing to me saying, I owe the government $5,000. I was an idiot. I didn't know I couldn't write this off. Or somebody writing me and saying, yeah, I made some poor decisions with a credit card and I got hit with a really hard percentage. And yeah, I owe a lot of money to this credit card company and I'm paying it off as fast as I can, but I feel like I'm treading water. These are really smart people, really clever folks, and they're finding themselves with some sort of weird secret shame. I think that needs to end. So I've decided to be really open about it. And I really was kind of racking my brain for, besides my salary coming in, finding ways to pay this debt down faster. And this podcast came to be. Over the years, I've given a lot of presentations. You can find them online. I talk about history and I talk about something I'm working on. And it really worked out well, but I was also spending a lot of money traveling. So I've kind of cut out most of my travel budget, and that money is going into debt repayment. But then people don't get to hear the presentations. So this is a presentation. So where this will go from here, not sure, but I do know that if there's one thing I did love of the last 20 years, no matter how much it cost me, it was telling stories. Telling stories that I thought would never be told. The Bulletin Board System documentary has something like 5 hours of episodes, but there's actually something like 200 hours of stories that I got from traveling around the country. Get Lamp is about 100 hours of that. The two documentaries that I'm working on right now, 6502 and Arcade, they have something on the order of 200 hours of footage. It's just all this amazing stuff happened. And if it's not packaged up perfectly for people, it seems like it just falls by the wayside and we don't learn about them, or we never knew that things went that deep or that cool or that interesting. So I'm going to reach back into a lot of this that I picked up from talking in conversations or what I experienced myself, and maybe you'll like it. Maybe it'll be something. I'll give a quick example. During the BBS documentary filming, I spoke to one guy and he told me a story and it didn't end up on film. All the best stories start with the words, "Please turn off the camera." And one of these was a guy who ran a bulletin board system in the DC area, and it was a 2-line bulletin board system. So that meant that 2 people could call up at the same time, and they could either use 2 nodes of the bulletin board system, or they could chat with each other. And the setup of the guy's computer system was that it was in their bedroom. And so they could lie in bed and actually see the bulletin board system light up. And if they left the screen on, they could see what was going on in a split screen. And so they were always kind of living with this bulletin board system in their lives. And this guy's wife discovered that a couple was having an affair on the bulletin board system. And that meant that they were knowing when to get onto the bulletin board system, and they would chat, and then they would plan out their trysts. And she was so offended because this computer was both in a place in the virtual space, the computer bulletin board space, but it was in their bedroom. And there was this sin going on inside of the bedroom all the time. So she would always see who was connecting. And if one of the couple connected and she saw the other one dialing in, she would disconnect one or the other. She would make sure that one of them mysteriously lost their connection. so that this couldn't happen anymore. She was a hand of God deciding that this sin was not going to happen. And speaking of disconnecting people, on my own bulletin board system back in the early 1980s, I ran a bulletin board called The Works BBS. And The Works had two monitors, one that was in the computer room, and I was running a connection through the black and white connector on my IBM PC over to my bedroom. And I had a screen there, and I could see people logging on to the bulletin board system, which sounds like the most boring, but was actually one of the more interesting TV channels I could ever want to watch. And I would see people log on and see them type messages and things. But of course, occasionally people would be on and just be jerks or trying to hack into the system or causing trouble. And after a while, at 16, you're lazy as heck, I was trying to figure out, how can I disconnect these people? And so what I did was I ran a really long electrical wire all the way back to my bedroom, and I put a switch, a moment switch, on the top of a film canister that I had made a hole in. And I had this big red button, and I called it the loser be gone button. One press of the loser be gone button, and this guy lost his carrier. And so, of course, people who visited me at my house saw this button, and they said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's the loser be gone button." And it became a matter of lore. The loser be gone button lived well past the Works. It was referred to as any time the Works knocked somebody off, that we initiated the loser be gone button, and maybe in my mind I still have the loser be gone button ready to go. I actually really miss that piece of my life where I would go down to Radio Shack and I would buy random parts, and without really any electrical engineering knowledge or understanding that I was ruining the quality of the phone line or ruining a connection to a headset, I would go in there and just wire in these completely weird headphone connectors or weird cross connections between phone lines and just try crazy things. And in the modern world, where everything is wireless and you have to either solder or program to get things going, I just stepped away from it, and I really miss it. I really miss when things were so simple that you could actually just connect a wire and change everything. When textfiles.com came up, and it's celebrating nearly 20 years now, I found out that a lot of people had learned about these different tricks and traps from what were called boxes. That is to say, simple circuits that would sit on phone lines and in some way change the interface to the phone system or change how your phone worked. And I was always fascinated at the fact that what these text files that had survived untold amounts of lost bulletin board systems and disk transfers and crappy hard drives, what made them live, what gave them that level of survivability that even to this day, 40 years later, you can still find them, is the fact that they were secrets. They were hints that this monolithic phone system of the 70s and 80s, as it went and fell apart, was a place of wonder that you, with a few simple steps, could control and master in a way that other people couldn't. And I've always said that that was the real power of the bulletin board system text file, was the fact that even if you weren't going to build a nuclear bomb or hack up a conference system or steal phone codes, you knew that this document was your simple step to do it, and that made your life something that you controlled a little more. Maybe even more than a 9-year-old who wonders when his family is going to be back together again. We have so much to learn from these old text files, and I'm really happy that even here, so many years later, that textfiles.com still lives, that I'm still pulling things from it, and every once in a while I get this great fan mail from somebody, especially somebody who is themselves in their teens. And I'd always set up textfiles.com to be a site that didn't have any advertisements, didn't have any click-throughs, didn't require you to register. that you would just step in and there would be a almost endless library of files, very lightly sorted, very lightly curated, that would go into every weird direction, especially about things that are unintentionally at the time, time capsules of technology and interactions with that technology that are long gone. I mean, if you try to explain to somebody how local phone toll charges work, the fact that there were exchanges that meant something to your exchange, and if you called after 6 p.m. or you called after 11 p.m., there would be marked differences in how many dollars you were paying to make phone calls. I don't think any of that would really scan, but they might be able to figure out, wow, they were faced with problems of how to spend their money, and they used tricks and chicanery and shared information to get around that problem. That's pretty amazing. When I get mail about textfiles.com from people who are too young to remember a time before cell phones and GPS, what I do get from them is a sense that they think of people from the previous generation as heroes or pioneers. And so I always get this very interesting, wistful thing that says, I missed everything. It's gone. Nothing's left. There was all this amazing stuff. It was so rich. It was so beautiful. And it's gone. And I'm never going to see it. And I'm always telling people, don't think that, because where we are now is wonderful. You know, we live in a world now where, yeah, sure, the bizarreness of getting lost isn't one that was the default. It's not a world anymore where one has to think for more than 10 seconds about who played what on some sitcom you dimly remember. It's definitely not a place where you're left adrift wondering if your friends are where you think they are and if they're going to actually meet you at the mall. But it's definitely a world where you get past being lost and get into a world where you're doing nothing but finding new things every day. If you have the initiative to sit down and study it, find out what others have said, record yourself or write about yourself working on what you're learning, and finding other people to partner with, to collaborate with, and build lifelong friendships that will shape the course of who you are. That is amazing. You know, as this podcast goes on, I'm going to definitely want to reach out to people who are listening to hear about what kind of stories they want to hear from me, what parts they have questions about. And I'd especially love it if people had some sort of lingering concern or question about something they've heard from me and they want to know it to a greater depth. I love talking about the gritty details of something that I'm working on, or something that I've said, or something that's in one of the documentaries, and finding out the story behind it. You know, I spent 5 years shooting my first documentary, and I spent 4 years shooting the second, and I've spent 5 years on and off working on other documentaries, and there's a lot of life in there. It's something that has a lot of things that just didn't make it on the final product, or that I haven't brought up somewhere. So if something has gone by of mine, either on the sites or in the movies, please write in. I'm Jason at textfiles.com. I've been that now for 20 years, and it's fantastic. So next week, I'll go into more stories, more ideas, more experiences, and we'll see if I can talk my way out of it. Thanks so much to the 161 Patreon subscribers who have contributed towards this week's episode, especially Sam Johnston, Sebastian, Kevin Waters, and James Bekoyanu, who all gave at the $50 and above level. Thanks so much for that. I'm really, really excited to see where this podcast goes, to have the opportunity to talk to people each week, and, you know, maybe learn something along the way. Thanks so much.